Hi everybody, welcome to Bone2Pick. I'm Michael Davis, and I am extremely honored to have the opportunity to sit down with our Artist of the Month, one of the greatest orchestral trombone players of all time, one of the great trombonists of all time, Mr. Ralph Sauer. Ralph was the principal trombonist of the Los Angeles Philharmonic for 32 years. He's an internationally acclaimed soloist, a distinguished educator. He's a founding member of the Summit Brass. On a personal note, I'm extremely grateful that Ralph was willing to lend his talents to one of my projects, the Brass Nation CD, many years back now. And I'm also very grateful that he took time out of his busy schedule this week to be with us. So Ralph, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
My pleasure, Mike.
And I want to just give a quick shout out to the great Joe Alessi. Ralph is working with the New York Philharmonic this week here in New York and staying at Joe's house where we are right now. And Joe was kind enough to let us shoot this interview here today. So thank you very much, Joe, for allowing us into your beautiful home. I'd like to kind of just jump in and start from your early years and your memories of growing up in Philadelphia. And maybe what are some of the things that made you gravitate to the trombone and decide to make music your life's work?
Well, I started in elementary school like most of the kids, and with a very, very wonderful man who, Joseph Doran was his name, and he kept everyone interested in playing. And by the time I was perhaps 13 or 14, he realized he couldn't go much further with me, and he was instrumental in getting me with Robert Harper, who was bass trombone in the Philadelphia Orchestra. So I started with him, I think, around age 14, and shortly thereafter got in the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra. And that was the big revelation for me, that this is, I think, what I want to do. And I even remember the piece that I made that decision. It was Sibelius Second. And you know, this wonderful brass writing, especially at the end, it was just so uplifting that this is what I want to do. So unlike a lot of kids today, I knew where I was going at a very early age. So, and I just kept on that path. And my last 2 years of high school were in Syracuse, New York. My father was transferred up there, and I was lucky enough to study with Emory Remington when I was still in high school on Saturday mornings, and I went to Eastman as a logical extension of that. So,
Of course.
So that was my educational background.
Must have been a great opportunity to hear the Philadelphia Orchestra at that time, especially, seemed to be at its apex.
Right, and in addition to Harper, the first trombone way back was Gusakov, who had this unbelievable sound. And then Henry Smith came in, who was, you know, just a wonderful, wonderful player. And then the Rochester Philharmonic had wonderful trombones too.
Of course.
And I would just say in passing, there's something that's very unusual. That neither of my teachers ever played a note for me in a lesson.
Wow.
And I'm not sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it did enable me to kind of learn and produce a sound that I had in my head rather than trying to imitate a teacher. And of course I had a lot of influence from listening to other players, but I thought that was kind of unique probably that neither teacher ever illustrated one point in the lesson.
I think you're right. It's probably, it kind of gives some space in your own playing in your own head in terms of how you want your sound to be shaped. It gives that opportunity to happen. That's very cool. Well, that leads me into one of the things I really wanted to talk to you a lot about in this interview, and you've already touched on Emory Remington. And I should say, for those of you, obviously players of our generation, we certainly know who the great Emory Remington is, but a lot of times when I go out and do clinics and master classes myself these days, a lot of people aren't as aware of him as I think he deserves to be. He's certainly, for my money, he's probably the greatest brass teacher of all time, certainly greatest trombone teacher or among the greatest. And he taught at the Eastman School for over 50 years and turned out such a legacy of great trombonists, from all the way, of course, from Ralph Sauer to Bill Reichenbach and Jim Pugh and Steve Witzer and Scott Hartman, and I mean, there's just...
In the generation before that, Gordon Pulis and Van Haney and...
Yes, very important to mention them as well. But Ralph, maybe you could talk about your experience being at Eastman, what that was like in terms of the school, and then also, you know, how your experience with Emory Remington was and how he shaped you as a player, and also I would imagine he had an impact on you as in the future becoming a teacher as well.
Yes, I'm trying to write a book now, and one of the chapters is going to be about my experiences with Mr. Remington. And I can't write anything down at this point because I can't answer the question. I'm not quite sure what happened there. It was an osmosis type of teaching. I don't remember anything specific that he said, you know, like put your tongue here or do this or do that. He just sang in your lessons, and somehow by osmosis it came over and you played. So my chapter on him is going to be very small because there was nothing really to tell except somehow he allowed you to learn, and this magic happened. And I try to do that sometimes, but I'm just not the type to say, well, that was very good, but if you tongue a little bit more like this, it might help. I mean, I can't resist doing that. While he would say, well, no, more like this, ta 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 ta, and oh, so it was an osmosis kind of teaching, and he was just the greatest man ever. He was everybody's grandpa, and he was just an amazing person on a personal level. But as far as his teaching, it was vague in a way, but you absorbed it.
That's quite interesting because our good friend Bill Reichenbach, who I consider one of the great trombone players of all time, said basically the exact thing you just said. He said, you know, I got there and he would sing a lot in lessons and I just trusted that it was going to work out, and obviously it did for Bill and yourself, of course.
And when he stopped singing for a measure or two, it didn't work so well. And when I'm playing well, I hear him, because he always sat there and the student sat here.
Okay.
I hear him singing and I'm playing well. As soon as I stop listening to him singing, the playing is not as good.
That's great. Well, that shows the power of singing, I think, and that quality within your playing, having that kind of vocal idea. You know, it should also be noted nowadays the trombone choir is such a prevalent thing in all the major music programs around the country and around the world, and it's such an amazing sound, and I've written a lot of things for the trombone choir, and I love it. And, you know, I think you were a big part of that, the movement that he started having the trombone choir. What was that like in terms of having that ensemble with him?
When you all of a sudden have 25 trombone players standing there and playing together, that was a real revelation. And that actually got me started in arranging too, because he encouraged the students to write arrangements for the group. And so that started that whole part of my career.
Yeah, it's really an amazing, he was a very important figure, you know, in terms of brass pedagogy and shaping what was to come, you know, for decades really. So, well, let's talk a little bit about, well, I know a lot of you may know there's all kinds of stories that float around about your exit from Eastman, but we could talk about that. But I think you put it best. Whatever how did you say it?
Well, I just said whenever you have a choice between the facts and the legend, you always go with the legend. So whatever you've heard is true.
Okay, so we'll leave your exit to the legend, and whatever you've heard is true. You went into the Army for it sounded. I like that you described it as 2 years, 7 months, and 5 days. So
yeah,
maybe not the best 2 years, 7 months, 5 days of your life.
Well, I had a couple of good job offers, and it was the height of the Vietnam War, and rather than be drafted, I signed up for the Army Band, and I was a little bit bitter about having to do that, interrupt a career and not take a couple of jobs, and so I wasn't the happiest soldier, but and I made life miserable. I'm sorry to say for some of those people. I apologize, but I did get out at a time when there were, I think, 7 or 8 openings in orchestras. So it was a good time to get out of the Army because the following year there were no openings for trombone, and who knows what I would have been doing. So. And so speaking of that led you to the job in Toronto Symphony. Yes.
Maybe you could share some of your memories of being there. I think you were there for 6 years.
Yes.
And also, in addition to being in the orchestra, you were working with the CBC a little bit, which is kind of a precursor to what would happen to you in Los Angeles years later. And I believe you also did some teaching at University of Toronto.
Yes.
Maybe you could share your whole Toronto experience with us.
Well, I was hired by Seiji Ozawa. his last year there was my first year. And the other unique thing about that job is the first 6 weeks of every season was opera. They did not have a separate opera orchestra at that time. And I think one of the reasons I got the job is because at the audition there were quite a few opera excerpts asked. And at that time there were no lists sent out. You were expected to play whatever they put on the stand. And I knew all those opera excerpts from studying with Harper. And I think some of the other major players who were in contention for that job probably didn't do so well on the opera excerpts.
Interesting.
So here was a young kid coming out of college with no real prior experience who could play all this stuff. And I think that's why he just decided, well, I'll take a chance. And it worked out.
Yeah.
But it was great for me because I was learning the repertoire and had a nice section to work with, and it was a great learning experience. I also got to hang out with Gordon Pulis for a while because he was in the area. He played the first couple of months for me because I couldn't get out of the Army in time. So I finally got to hang out with my hero, and I tell you, the first rehearsal, we needed 4 trombones on the pieces we were playing, and the first rehearsal, my first professional job, I'm playing first trombone and Gordon Pulis is playing third trombone. Talk about an experience.
Right? Oh, that's a great story. Wow, fantastic. And at that time, I think Toronto, is still a big center, of course, but at that time there seemed to be a lot of recording work going on as well. It must have been quite a bit of the CBC.
The union was very tight there against imports, and there was a 2-year waiting period to do any kind of union work.
Oh, interesting.
So I didn't do anything for the first 2 years outside the orchestra, unless the orchestra was hired for a specific date. So, but eventually I started doing more varied stuff. They did a lot of contemporary music concerts, and we did ballet occasionally. So I really got a good education there. And then when the LA thing opened up, I'd never been to California before. I just came out and decided this is maybe where I need to be rather than Toronto.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that because that's obviously everybody associates you so strongly with your years in Los Angeles. You were appointed principal trombone by Zubin Mehta in 1974.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, I have several questions I want to ask you about the orchestra and the folks that you worked with there, but in particular, just take us through those first couple of years there, and maybe also the audition process. I'm curious as to how it might compare to the auditions that take place now.
They had an East Coast audition and a West Coast audition back then. And I remember coming to Carnegie Hall and playing in the recital hall. And we had a round of solo playing and then some excerpts. And again, there was no list. You were expected to play whatever they put up. And so I won the East Coast round and then was invited to come to play with the orchestra. And they had 2 other finalists, I think, from the West Coast auditions. So I came in and they made me play the concert that night without a rehearsal, Mozart Requiem. And I played the second part. He actually wanted me to play the first part and then switch to the solo, and I said, no way. So I played the Mozart Requiem, and then they decided they would listen to the other guys. A month goes by, I don't hear anything. They said, we want you to come back again. So I came back again, and I was a day early, and I listened to a children's concert out in the hall. And I heard that the trombones were making a lot more, let's say, a more brilliant tone than I was used to. So I'm figuring, I better brighten it up a little bit if I want to get in this group. So the next day we started rehearsals on Bruckner 8, which was my audition piece. So I put my little bit smaller mouthpiece. I was playing on a Schilke 51, but I had a Remington underpart made for my rim, which gave a lot more brilliant tone. So I put that mouthpiece in. I played the first part of the rehearsal, and he calls me in at the break, and he says, well, it sounds very good, but it's too bright. And so I figured, well, this is not going to be a problem here. And I said, okay, I'll fix it. And I could see him kind of rolling his eyes. Yeah, sure, he's going to fix his sound, you know, in 2 minutes. So I went back, put my regular mouthpiece in, played the rest of the rehearsal. He calls me in after the rehearsal. He says, how did you do that? This is exactly the sound I want. So I knew I had him at that point.
Yeah.
But he was a great, he still is a great conductor to play for. He's very demanding for the brass, and in a good way. He has a good ear for brass, and he knows what he wants.
You know, that's, for all of us, actually, that's a tremendous lesson. Like, first of all, you're listening to what's going on. You decided to make an adjustment, and then you have the wherewithal to make the adjustment back to whatever you need to do. To me, that's what being a musician is, and listening and trying to adapt. So clearly, you know, the success you've had throughout your career is you know, you had that early on, and we're approaching things in that way.
It's a mistake to try to second guess what you think they want, because maybe they don't want what they've had before. Maybe they want to change, and if you go in and start trying to play a different game than your game, I mean, I could have made a huge mistake doing that. Let's say if I had forgotten my other mouthpiece, I probably wouldn't have gotten the job, but because I tried to second guess what I thought they wanted.
That's a great point, really good point. Back when I was a student at Eastman, I had a brass quintet that we played in, and our first trumpet player, a gentleman named Kevin Brown, was a wonderful player, and he was a student of Tom Stevens, who was, of course, the principal trumpet in LA for many years. And we got to go out to LA for a chamber music competition, and Tom was generous enough to get us some seats to hear you guys play, and we got to hear you play Petrushka. I think it was in 1982. And you guys were so nice to us. We came back and got to meet you. And of course, I gravitated to your playing and was so, you know, focused on the trombones. But maybe you could talk a little bit about what it was like. That brass section was so great. You know, of course, the trombone section was outstanding. But then you had Tom Stevens in principal trumpet. You had Roger Bobo. Such a great section. Maybe you could touch on some of your thoughts about that.
Well, I think it was a very balanced section. And the good part is we were all close friends too. There was no friction in that way, and I never had to sit down with Tom and try something. We just did it, and whatever little problems maybe had been there at the first rehearsal just automatically went away by the second rehearsal. We never rehearsed or practiced anything together. There was that kind of flexibility, and he had a sound that was compact. Not this, but compact enough that you could just get inside that sound and blend or whatever you had to do. And of course, Roger on the bottom was a monster player. And the trombone section, we played together for all those years, and we're close friends, and we went on vacations together, all the low brass. So I mean, it was just a wonderful experience. And I would say balance would be the best way I could describe that brass section. There wasn't anyone who seemed to dominate. It was a balanced idea that we could play out when we needed to, but we had the right balance, I think, with the rest of the orchestra.
Yeah. Even as a college student and not, you know, having the wherewithal about what's going on in the orchestra, but I remember that being a very distinct thing about your section. Just it felt like everything was balanced and there was strength everywhere when there needed to be. You know, quite a unique situation, I think, and it was such a pleasure to hear.
We knew when to turn the turbos on, but we also knew how to get out of the way. We just didn't play every forte loud.
Right. So these low brass vacations, was any beer drinking involved on any of those?
There were some adult beverages here and there,
okay.
yes.
Okay.